For years, the Viking Tomb in Red Dead 2 was just treated as another curious mystery left by Rockstar. A skeleton on an altar, dozens of skulls scattered around the place, raising a lot of questions about what actually happened there. But what if I told you that new evidence has finally been found? Evidence hidden deep within the game's own files that completely changes how we see this untold story. Proof that turns the old world runestone from a friendly tale into something controversial and way darker. For 7 years, this mystery stayed wide open, with only interpretations, theories, and debates. Who are those skeletons scattered around the temple? Are they Native Americans or the Vikings themselves? But now, with new discoveries made through data mining, the narrative takes a whole new direction. And when we connect this info with the real history of the Vikings, the rituals described in the Norse sagas, and some little-known historical references, what seemed like just an Easter egg turns into one of the most macabre and clever constructions Rockstar has ever made. In this video, you'll follow the full investigation. We'll analyze the stone, we'll analyze the bones, and we'll dig into the game's internal files, cross-referencing all of that with real historical parallels from the Norse people. By the time we're done, you'll never look at that tomb the same way again. But first, we have to check out a mysterious and often overlooked spot in Roanoke Ridge. The Old World Scriptures located right at this point on the map close to the town of Ansburg. And when we got there, we found this beautiful and curious stone. This rock stands out from the others because besides being one of the world's points of interest, it also has extremely mysterious carvings resting on its surface like scars left by a past that refuses to be forgotten. The content of the rock is a mystery, so much so that when examining the site, Arthur writes in his journal that he wishes he knew what those carvings mean. In other words, the message is an enigma for the protagonist, but only for him, because the community cracked that message pretty quickly. During the investigation, it was discovered that these symbols are made up of Phoenician letters, which, for those who don't know, are one of humanity's oldest alphabets, created in the Middle East over 3,000 years ago, and that influenced many later writing systems. With that in mind, the letters were decoded as follows. We arrived by boat, beautiful land, gracious people, so we let them live in peace. Whoever wrote this message, the idea is clear. There was no fight, no massacre, just a friendly exchange between Native Americans and outsiders. But the friendly and peaceful tone changes completely. When we find out that, with this stone, Rockstar created an intriguing historical distortion to confuse the player, since this stone is directly linked to the Viking Roanoke tomb. Within the game's context, these carvings would have been left by the Viking people who at some point in history landed in the region and interacted with the natives. And this is exactly where the story takes a step back and fiction takes the lead, because historically speaking it would be impossible for Vikings to have written in Phoenician letters since this people used the runic alphabet known as Futhark and not writing systems from the ancient Mediterranean. But in Rockstar's reimagined story, this detail was simply set aside. Proof of this is the real-life reference that this stone makes, serving as an Easter egg to the famous Zingiva runestones raised in Sweden in the early 11th century, honoring warriors who died on distant expeditions, with inscriptions carved along serpents and etched into the rock. This way, the connection between the stone and the Vikings is established, which raises an unavoidable question. If the Vikings reported that their stay in America was peaceful, why is the tomb in Roanoke full of death and brutality? This is where the mystery begins, because something definitely doesn't add up. Did the Viking people drop their wolf stance and take on the role of a lamb, becoming victims of the Native Americans? That's what we're about to find out. Arriving at the mysterious tomb in Roanoke, we find a place marked by violence and brutality. The structure, made up of some underground tunnels, features an altar at its center that takes center stage. Beneath it lies a corpse in an advanced state of decomposition, adorned with several human skulls. This reveals that the body under the altar wasn't the only one sacrificed in that structure. Exploring the dark and cold tunnels of the tomb, we can find a trio of items that reveal who the place belonged to. A Viking axe and helmet, which are part of the traditional attire of the famous Scandinavian people. Besides the accessories, we also find a valuable Viking comb that can be sold for about $50. In other words, the architectural style of the place and the items leave no doubt. Such a ritualistic tomb is the work of the Viking people who, at some point in history, set foot on what would become North America. But now a question arises. Who are these dead people? Since within the game's lore, the Viking accounts in the Old World writings say their stay in America was friendly. Well, since 2018, there has never been a clear, conclusive answer about what really happened, and that's intentional. A doubt deliberately planted by Rockstar, mixing fictional elements with history. Proof of this is found in Arthur and John's journal entries when they analyzed the structure. When visiting the grave in 1899, Arthur wonders who those people were. Years later, in 1907, John wonders who those people were and who killed whom. With these accounts, Rockstar makes it clear that the interpretation is open. The answer isn't objective, but rather interpretative. But the answer finally came, more than half a decade after the release of Red Dead 2. The truth about the Vikings has finally been revealed, so get ready because we're going to find out exactly what happened. But first, there's a stoic curiosity about Arthur and John's doubt. For us citizens of the Western world, it's pretty obvious that such a grave and its items belong to the Viking people. But within the game's context, with the protagonists being criminals and somewhat educated, it's natural there would be doubt and lack of knowledge about the subject. But beyond that, there can also be historical inaccuracies. Like I said, this curiosity mixes fictional and historical elements, and looking at what's known about the Viking people, we find there's no reliable evidence they ever set foot on what is now the United States. What is known based on archaeological proof is that Scandinavian peoples established a settlement in Canada around the year 1000 AD. Outside of that, there's no confirmed archaeological evidence of Viking settlements in what today corresponds to the United States, although Irish sagas do mention explorations beyond Canada, so it's clear that the tomb found in Roanoke represents a creative liberty taken by the Red Dead 2 writers, who created this lore by mixing history with fiction. With that clear, it's time to uncover the big truth behind the Viking Tomb. As Arthur's and John's journals reveal, the protagonists have a lot of questions about what happened at that place, who those people were, and most importantly, who was killed. Were they the Native Americans? Even though this was a practice attributed to the Vikings, Old World writings challenge this scenario and make us wonder if, perhaps, it was the Vikings themselves who were the victims. The truth finally came out in February 2026, 7 years after the game's release. While the Strange Man channel was digging through the tomb files in the PC version during data mining, the YouTuber found an interesting name on one of the tomb's objects, specifically on this stone next to the altar. Inside the files, it's titled Bloody Eagle, or in Portuguese, Águia de Sangue. Anyone who's seen the Viking series knows this, but Blood Eagle is one of the execution rituals attributed to the Scandinavian people. According to the Norse sagas, the so-called Blood Eagle was a ritualistic execution where the victim was laid face down, their ribs separated from the spine with a blade, and the lungs pulled out through the back, symbolically forming a pair of wings. Now take a look at the corpse on the altar in Roanoke. Even though the ribs aren't separated from the spine, it's positioned at the center of the structure as if it's the focus of a ritual. Around it, dozens of skulls reinforce the idea of a massacre, and the internal file's name leaves no room for coincidence: Bloody Eagle. If the object is named in the files as Blood Eagle, the message here is clear, that death wasn't ordinary, it was ritualistic. And this is where everything changes, because if there was a ritual execution, there was deliberate violence. And if there was deliberate violence, the peaceful inscription in the Old World scriptures starts to look like a lie. With this discovery, the reading of the stone shifts completely. The Vikings claimed they arrived by boat, found a beautiful land, and let the natives live in peace. But the tomb tells a different story, a story of brutal execution with dozens of skulls that, within the game's logic, belong to Native Americans. In other words, within the lore built by Rockstar, the Vikings weren't friendly, on the contrary, they slaughtered. But here an important question arises. When analyzing historical accounts of the ritual, we found that it was meant for high-status enemies, defeated kings, major enemy leaders, and especially traders. From this perspective, it's strange to imagine the Vikings performing such a ritual on simple Native Americans, who wouldn't fit as major political enemies within the Norse power structure. That's why another hypothesis comes up. If we look at it from a coherent historical viewpoint, maybe the best explanation is that the person executed under the altar was a Viking deserter, a major trader. Meanwhile, the various skeletons around would belong to the natives, who likely died in simpler, less ritualistic ways than the central figure on the altar. But as we saw throughout this video, historical accuracy isn't exactly the strong suit of this little detail, and looking through the eyes of Rockstar's writers, it wouldn't be crazy to assume that the person on the altar was a Native American leader turned into a symbol within the story created for the game. But now I want to hear from you. Who was the person executed on the altar of the tomb? Could it be a great Viking deserter, or the Native American leader who led the battle against the Norse? Drop your take in the comments and let's debate. And if you're into deep, dense mysteries like this one that take years to solve, I recommend you check out the playlist about the spiderweb mystery, a curiosity discovered more than half a decade after the game's release, with the investigation still ongoing and the mystery wide open. The truth hasn't been found yet, and you can follow the full investigation right here on the channel. Just click the yellow arrow. So big hugs and see you later. Bye!